Well, the world is in a warming period. That doesn't come as a surprise to anyone that's been paying attention. However, some people like to go a little bit further than warming. They talk about boiling. They talk about the end of the world. The climate cult, as I like to think of it, because it is the modern day doomsday cult, very, very fashionable amongst the rich and powerful, and especially amongst those who would like to get richer or more powerful. It throws up some interesting contradictions sometimes, and some things that would be viewed, you would have thought, as good can sometimes be lamented by the very people who you would have thought would have been celebrating that slightly warmer weather. One such example has been brought to my attention by the wonderful Joanne. Jo, thank you so much for coming on the Aussie Wire again.
Always a pleasure to talk to you, Topher.
Now, we have a lot of fun here at the Aussie Wire. We syndicate your blogs, with your permission, of course, onto the Aussie Wire, and it's always a great read. And this is a great blog that you've put together. Tell us what's going on. This is quite... I would have thought this would be a good thing, Jo. Tell me why this is a problem.
Well, not a problem, but these archaeologists in Norway were delighted, excited, ecstatic to find as many as 4,000 items of things like spears made with shells that are coming out of the ice as the glaciers melt. And what they're finding are things like clothes, hunting gear, leather bridles, obviously all handmade because there weren't too many industrial factories around then. So 3,600 years ago, we're talking about 1600 BC, and it's or 1500 BC. It's just extraordinary that these things have been preserved in the ice so well. And I think that there's a spear that you can show us, which is made from a shell. And as I said, today some youngsters glued themselves to a road at the thought of a half a degree of temperature rise. But imagine having to kill your dinner with a shell strapped to a stick. I mean, it's such a different way of life. And so I love these archaeological studies just because of the way it makes us reassess the things we're complaining about today, but also because it tells us so much, and it tells us that the weather was warmer. So in 1600 BC, in the Bronze Age, the weather was warmer, the ice wasn't there, someone dropped their spears and the ice fell on it and sealed it in for all this time. And we can see in Greenland ice cores that the temperature back in the Minoan period was warmer. And so all this ice has come since then. So we end up with this contradiction, this amazing thing where the ice melt has revealed all these treasures from the past. And this researcher is lamenting that the ice has melted because, blame climate change, because the ice it's global warming, right? What a tragedy.
Well, this is where it gets really quite hilarious for me. I jumped on, so this is Secrets of the Ice. This is his blog. Now, he seems like a legitimate explorer. Good on him. He seems to be pouring his heart and soul into his work. I'm not here to take a cheap shot at him. But if you go through the articles that he's written here, and this is quite a catalogue of work, an impressive body of work spanning many, many years, there is a tone all the way through here of this lamenting this ice melt, lamenting the fact that these glaciers are disappearing. Glacial archaeology and global warming. This one caught my eye, and I had to read, and I had to have a laugh because he was talking about the fact that a lot of these artifacts are being found actually underneath all of the ice, on top of the rocks directly. And he talks about the fact that actually that doesn't mean that that's where they were when they got dropped, and then it froze over the top. No. It could have been dropped into the snow, and then as the snow has melted away, and then refreezing and melting away and refreezing, it all ends up being buried under this ice. Now, that's a process that we understand well. We've seen this happen before with objects, with abandoned planes from World War II as one example of artifacts that get left in the ice. But here he is lamenting the melt and lamenting the human impact on the climate, and then in the very next breath talking about the fact that it has been completely ice-free within just the last few thousand years. What happens to these otherwise incredibly intelligent people that they can't see what they're even saying?
It's like a cult, isn't it?
It's phenomenal.
It's the idea that global warming is a terrible thing, and yet here he is studying ancient civilizations which flourished. Humans survived and thrived in Norway. And, let's just ask that the poor guy who lost the, being sexist, of course, assuming that it was a guy, who lost the spear that he'd handmade, and how they would have felt about the tragedy of us living in a colder climate. Would they really want to swap? talk about the fact that so many humans thrived in the Holocene. This is a real problem for computer models. It's called the Holocene. It's a conundrum. And the conundrum is the models just can't figure this one out because there wasn't very much CO2 around then, and yet it was so warm. So they keep trying to adjust the records and find cooling and colder periods way back then. But from 4,000 to about 9,000 years BC, the weather was warmer, sea levels were higher all around the world. I mean, how do you argue with higher sea levels? And in Australia, we're talking 1 to 2 meters higher. About 7 to 8,000 years ago. I mean, it's extraordinary. So warmer, and yet all these humans who had no mobile phones, no cars, no satellites, and no power stations, somehow they thrived.
It's just because Al Gore wasn't there to tell them how badly off they were. I mean, Al Gore has done us such a favour by letting us know just how much of a disaster a little bit of warming is going to be. Of course, the infamous hockey stick and so much more. Joe, we've been talking about climate change now for, what's it going to be, 11, 12 years? You've been talking about it for well beyond that point in time. But I don't remember the exact, it might have only been 10 years ago that I interviewed you for the 50 to 1 project. And we were talking about it at the time and saying to each other, maybe another 5 years and this thing will be over because the evidence is stacking up so completely to show that CO2 is not a primary driver of the climate. Maybe there is some impact, but it is clearly not a primary driver of the climate. 10 years later, we're still sitting here and governments are throwing themselves headlong at net zero and all kinds of other nonsense in pursuit of this cult. What is it actually going to take to break the spell of this thing?
Well, honestly, the spell of this thing is driven by money, and you've heard me talk about it so many times before, and it's the profits made by things, and we have to attack it at its source. I mean, I'm all for debunking this through explaining the evidence, the scientific things, and that's what drives me. I'm fascinated by it. But ultimately, money, fame, status, and also this spiritual vacuum. I think a lot of people, good people, are drawn into this because it fills a need to feel like they're useful because, hey, I'm changing the weather in 100 years. And even though I fly on a plane to trips to Bali or Paris or wherever, really I'm a good person because I buy my carbon credits and I deserve all that. And it's a spiritual thing where I think it can assuage a lot of guilt by somehow believing they are being good for the children of the future, stopping storms and bad things, floods and whatnot. Putting solar panels on does that,
Yeah, but because those things never happened before the industrial era. Obviously, we know that nature was completely benign and there had never been a flood, a drought, a hurricane, or any kind of natural disaster prior to around about the year, 1750 or something like that. Being facetious, of course, for the fact checkers that are watching.
But I do believe we've got to attack the money at the source, and that's where, I mean, you've heard me talk about it quite a few times, and we'll spend more another day talking about the effects of things like the BlackRock and the pension funds and whatnot, who keep pushing this at the corporate board level and potentially rewarding careers of people who might be in politics to support these kind of things, as well as people in science. And we've got to turn off that tap. And the Republican governors of the US, 23 states, fighting back against that. So I do have hope that this will end. But until we deal with the money question, I don't think people are going to be popping the bubble of those in a spiritual kind of quest.
Yeah.
Because, you can't mock these things on television. But the day we can mock them, we are one good documentary shown on primetime TV from popping the bubble of that religion.
Well, I hope you're right, Joanne. Thank you so much once again for coming on the Aussie Wire.